Well, this is the last of the Denver shows.
It sure is, but that's sad.
It's sad. We've gotten so many shows. We had so much fun.
Oh, it was a lot of fun out there.
At this narrow gauge. The narrow gauge convention is always
fun.
And the ones in Denver area, I mean, not just Denver, but that whole area, Colorado Springs, doesn't matter. Just so much to do there.
Yes.
And we wore ourselves out doing everything there was to do there. It was that good.
Yes.
Anyway, this is the last of the shows. This is Jim Trowbridge's model railroad, another layout tour. Mm-hmm. It's an ON3 model railroad. Do you remember Jim? I told you about Jim.
Yeah, Jim Trowbridge. He's really familiar.
He's a well-known character in the narrow gauge community. Was one of the organizers of some of the oldest of the narrow gauge conventions going back to 1982.
Right.
And but what he became mostly known for is he'd run these charter trips.
Oh.
And he'd charter a freight train usually, and run a freight train usually on the Cumberson Toltec, sometimes on the Durango Silverton, always narrow gauge.
Yes.
And back then he had an HON3 layout, but he wanted to increase his scale, so he went to ON3.
Oh my goodness.
Calls his railroad the Colorado and Western.
Nice.
So check this out, Jim Trowbridge and the Colorado and Western ON3 layout. So it seems that Jim Trowbridge's Colorado and Western has been around for almost as long as the real narrow gauge has been around. I mean, not quite, of course. But this is a railroad that's been around for a long, long time. He completely started rebuilding the railroad in ON3 some years ago, but it's been under construction for so long that the scenery and structures are almost completely finished, even on this second version of the railroad. There's around 300 feet of mostly hand-laid mainline here, and of course a lot of other track as well, switching areas, yards, and that sort of thing. It's a mythological railroad, ostensibly connecting the Denver and Rio Grande Western and Colorado Midland standard gauge railroads in Aspen to the Denver and Rio Grande Western narrow gauge, as well as the Colorado and Southern in Gunnison. There's a surprising amount of Rio Grande Southern thrown in here as well, but a lot of the motive power is Rio Grande Southern. And speaking of Rio Grande Southern, I noticed a few galloping geese galloping about the railroad. As a real fan of structures, I'm just thrilled to see what's going on here. There's some really, really wonderful structures, and lots of them too. Of course, the build quality is first rate. I recognize a lot of these structures as different O-scale kits that are around, but some of it I don't recognize at all. I assume that that's scratch built. The scenery is beautiful, lots of figures, just really first rate. And the locomotives and rolling stock, really beautiful modeling. Beautiful models. Just, I love the weathering. And
yeah, they look real. Like I say, it really gives you the impression that I'm really there.
Of course, one of the reasons I get the feeling that I'm really there is I used to go out with Jim and ride chartered freight trains. That was something that Jim here used to do back in the day, and Mike Niederhauser and I went on a lot of his little chartered excursions on the narrow gauge. We were all a bit younger then. This is back on Jim's HON3 layout, the one that he tore down in order to build the ON3 layout that we've been looking at. But I've got a little bit of footage here that I shot back in the 80s of his HON3 railroad, and it was really a beautiful railroad as well. This mill has always been an inspiration to me. I just love it. I too was into HON3 at the time. I just couldn't get it to run right, so eventually I gave up. Of course, these days it's easy to get HON3 to run right. You just buy a Blackstone model and stick it on the track. So as I look at this old footage, I'm also incredibly impressed at how well the old railroad ran. Not only did it look just flat incredible, it ran really, really smoothly, and in this small scale, that was no mean feat back in the 1980s. Always fun to go clomping down memory lane in your galoshes and see what's the what. But this was a beautiful railroad. But where I met Jim was on his chartered trains that he used to run back in the day.
I just wanted to do some trips for myself where I could play around with a freight train. And since I can't afford to do it by myself, the idea was to get enough guys together to basically pay for a freight train. And so that's how it started.
Yeah.
I just started doing them a long time ago. Been doing them for quite a few years.
When?
First one was in 1971. So that goes back a ways.
On this lovely little excursion, we had the opportunity to repaint the locomotive and tender back to Rio Grande colors instead of the Cumberson Toltec. Sure made a beautiful freight train. Now that's some significant screwing around. Jim was also one of the earliest people to help put on a narrow gauge convention, and he took his charter trains and sort of attached them to the narrow gauge convention, putting on a charter in conjunction with a narrow gauge convention.
In fact, we had the narrow gauge convention that we put on in Denver in '82. We had a special trip on the Silverton after the convention, and we had a double header and did quite a few run-bys. It was actually pretty good for the Silverton at that time. They were pretty cooperative, and we must have gotten 8 or 10 run-bys that day, so that was pretty good. The weather was pretty stormy, and by the time we got to Silverton, the last run-by we did was in just a storm that was beating down on us. But I got some pretty spectacular shots of that, and those who stayed out did. Of course, we were soaking wet, but it was worth it.
Well, all things pass, and, well, Jim no longer puts on these charters, but fortunately, a lot of other people do, and boy, are they fun to take. Chartering your own freight train is certainly the high art of screwing around.
And that was the first of many interesting excursions where we had something go awry that, of course, the railroad didn't particularly enjoy, but as rail fans, we got a kick out of. We had to go into the siding at Sublet, and the engine that we used picked the points and dropped the pony trucks off the rail on the Frog, which is a terrible place to have to re-rail anything, and particularly pony trucks because you can't get to them very well. So we at that time we had the engineer was Marty Fisher, if you remember Marty, a little wisp of a gal that was a great engineer and a really good fireman. I still prefer to call her fireman. And she got out there, and I remember her picking up with the other guys that Frog, which they must weigh about 250 pounds roughly. Tote that thing in there and throw that underneath the track and get in there and knock the wedge in with a big ball peen hammer, and just a lot of fun. Now they didn't think it was too much fun, and I know it wasn't for them, but boy, we sure got some good shots of that, and that kind of led to each year we seemed to have something that would happen that would be very unique. We ran out of coal one year and had to bring the regular passenger train up and put their tender and our tender right across from each other, and then they had to get up and shovel coal from the top of a coal pile, which is very difficult, from the regular passenger train into our freight train. So after about a ton and a half, we figured we had enough to get home. But up until that point, there wasn't a piece of coal in that place, even a small nugget's worth. And so we were picking up ties along the way as we stopped for run-bys, and they were burning ties. They were burning everything they could think of to get us to a point where we could meet the train at Toltec and give her some pull. But we've had a lot of interesting things happen that, and of course the crew is excellent. They get right out there and they get it taken care of. But it's a lot of fun for us, headache for them.
Right? On a typical
Absolutely.
railroad, that's for sure.
Yes.
Yes, this isn't a model railroad, this is just a railroad. So as I watch Jim's new railroad operating down here in his basement, well, it brings a lot of baggage along with it, even though there's no baggage car. A lot of fun memories going around with Jim.
This is one impressive layout. I mean, you can tell he's been working on this for years and years.
And the fact that he had a layout before this one, the HO layout.
Oh my.
So experience. He's got a lot of experience with this stuff, and it really shows.
It sure does.
And check out the way he's done water here.
That is just fabulous. I talked to him how he's done that at length, and I think we're going to try that on our railroad.
I'm anxious. I've figured out a place to put in a waterfall and a stream and everything.
Oh boy.
I think the star of the layout is this structure here. It's actually a kit by Colorado Scale Models. It's the Como Roundhouse. And look how beautifully Jim has put this together and painted every single little stone. If you recall, the Como Roundhouse was the subject of the show 2 weeks ago, so check that out. They're restoring the Como Roundhouse, and now they even have a steam engine in there, so do check that out. What a great railroad.
And what a fun note to end our Denver Narrow Gauge Convention excursion.
It's been fun.
And I'll say it has.
We'll have to check out the next narrow gauge convention,
Absolutely, sure.
too. Well,
That was amazing.
that's a lot of shows out of the Denver convention. But oddly enough, we're not done with Colorado. No sooner did we get back to Utah than we get this phone call.
Yes.
And they say, hey, what are you guys doing? You want to come to Colorado and go on a caboose trip? Well, we just got back from Colorado. We'll get back in. So
Pack your suitcases.
we got right back in the car and headed right back because the
It's just
friends
the next state.
the friends of the Cumbers and Toltec decided to do a caboose hop by just invitation only.
Yes.
And 12 people, and we got to ride our own little personal train
Yes,
over
we
the whole
did.
railroad.
Yes, a caboose no less.
And so we couldn't say no to that. Are
Oh.
you kidding?
Never.
And so anyway, that's what we're going to be picking up doing for the next couple of shows is the caboose hop on the
Yeah.
Cumbers and Toltec.
We're back.
That's a lot of fun. Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, do pop over to the channel, Toyman Television. There's the website, toymantelevision.com. But the channel is where you can find 225, I think, something like that, movies. Just massive.
Yes.
And watch all of them, binge
Right.
watch. And if you're not a subscriber, subscribe and then binge watch all 225 of them.
Yeah,
There's something there for everybody.
exactly.
Well, maybe not everybody. We haven't done anything really
Yeah, we
that
haven't
weird.
done any
There's
sewing
some really
classes
weird
or-
people. Anyway, we digress.
Okay, yeah.
So do subscribe, and you can subscribe by clicking on the blue button. Zoink! You see the blue button over here that says subscribe? If you don't see it, try taking your phone and turning it. Not all devices support the blue button, but most do. Anyway, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here again on Wednesday with some more massive screwing around. See you then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.